the sports editor of The Nation, Dave Zirin, joining us here, host of the Edge Sports Podcast, and just stepped into the man cave, and all of a sudden, somebody feels like they're at Disneyland. What do you think?
It's unbelievable. I would love to do an article just touring all the different doodads here. Everything that's signed is just amazing. I mean, it's like a sports pop cultural cornucopia. I cannot get enough of this.
Well, we wanted to get some things that were different. Like you get signed jerseys, but then when you get the Ryan Leaf signed jersey from if the Colts had drafted him, he gave us that jersey. Then it has a little more meaning.
When you have one of Hootie's Grammys right in front of me,
I know.
When you got a letter from Mark Cuban, one of his fine letters from the NBA, that's a little beyond just the typical autograph swag.
Yes, yeah.
It's very cool. Now, as Jim Nantz, I got to tell you, every time I hear him say, "Hello, friends," like I have the instinct in my head, I think of John Travolta in Pulp Fiction saying, "I ain't your friend, Palooka." It just comes to me. And then I imagine Jim Nantz being like, "What did you say?" And I say, "I think you heard me punch you." I can't help it.
Hello, friends. All
I
right.
ain't your friend, Palooka.
You cover sports, but sort of as an outsider.
Yeah, I mean, my background is in sports writing. I was in the high school locker rooms in very rural Maryland. I mean, I've covered it from that perspective. But what I've done the last decade is really write about the intersection of sports and politics and going to places like the Olympics and the World Cup before the games actually start. So I look at things like the debt, displacement, hyper-militarization. So those issues that take place around the fringes of sports, without question, but that shape the games more than often we acknowledge or admit.
Let me start with the Greg Hardy coverage.
Yes.
Should ESPN have aired that?
No, that was horrible. That was an exercise in public relations. It was an embarrassment. And actually, I think it served the opposite of what the Adam Schefter, Drew Rosenhaus nexus wanted to produce, because that was a rehabilitation exercise to get Greg Hardy signed. But the reviews of it have been so terrible. Reviews aided and abetted by how Adam Schefter actually asked those questions and let Greg Hardy speak. And those reviews, I think, actually are going to keep Greg Hardy off of an NFL team this year. That's my prediction. Even though he's 27 and so skilled, I don't think he gets signed this year. And I think the way that Adam Schefter lets so much pass is a reason for that. And I got to tell you, I'm in town because I'm speaking at Sacred Heart University, and I was speaking to some journalism students last night. And these students were far angrier at Adam Schefter than Greg Hardy. Like they were incensed at just the craft of journalism that Adam Schefter portrayed. To have Greg Hardy say, "I was found not guilty," which isn't true. He was found guilty, and then the case was dismissed. And to not have Schefter ask the follow-up, which anyone who's read a 300-word synopsis on Wikipedia of Greg Hardy's domestic violence history would have known to ask, was just abominable. And then, of course, him also saying, "I never laid a hand on her, but I'm not saying I wasn't innocent," is so obvious, this kind of bizarre Clintonian, it depends on what your definition of is. So I didn't lay a hand on her, but I kicked her, but I hit her with a stick. Well, you didn't lay a hand on her, but you did something. So what did you put on this poor woman that led her to be covered in bruises? And the fact that he didn't follow up, and then what a lot of people were talking, people love your show at Sacred Heart. And so people were talking about the interview you did with Schefter. Like I said, he was more the focus than Hardy. And his answer to you, where he said, "It's not for me to say," when you asked him, "Do you think he was telling the truth?" I mean, that left these journalism students just flabbergasted. It's like, no, it is for you to say. Like, you're there to actually question him about this set of circumstances. You're looking at him in the eye. You're the person who set this up. It is for you to say whether you think he was being truthful or not. Because it certainly was for Adam to say that he didn't think he was a monster, that he think he deserves a second chance. So he had a lot to say about that, but didn't have a lot to say about whether or not he was guilty. It did not pass the smell test in any way.
Yeah. It felt like it was a, can you do me a favor with the agent with Greg Hardy, and you're trying to polish something that you can't polish.
You can't polish it. No matter how much Febreze you put on that particular pile of manure, that's not entering an NFL locker room. And this, I believe this was said on Deadspin, so I'm not, this isn't my own thought, but if Jerry Jones finds you too noxious for his locker room, I mean, that really does say something.
Are we more political or less political in the locker room now?
Oh, I think we're far more political in the locker room because of social media, because athletes feel like they can get around the filter of media, and because there are very real discussions and movements happening off the athletic field on questions of domestic violence, on questions of Black Lives Matter. And athletes don't live in this hermetically sealed chamber away from those discussions. And so it's by necessity not only affecting the locker room, but it's also pushing athletes to go to social media because, you know, they trust their own voice, I think, more than they trust a media member who's who they talk to, and then they're able to express themselves. And a great example of that is Steve Smith Sr., who just went off on Greg Hardy yesterday. He said, "I stand against domestic violence. My mother is a survivor." And very interesting that he used the word survivor and not victim, because that's the movement language around domestic violence. He said, "My mother is a survivor of domestic violence." And I think he basically said, "I think Greg Hardy is full of it." And so when you have Steve Smith Sr. say that, that drives a whole other news cycle about Greg Hardy, about the interview, about what Adam Schefter didn't ask. And I think it's those kinds of discussions that are taking place on social media which are going to ensure that Greg Hardy is not on a roster in September.
I also wanted your thoughts on baseball in Cuba, because it struck me as strange that, speaking of just let's put a nice veneer on this, a nice finish on it, and we're open for business here. And hey, don't worry about the poverty and enslavement over there that you're seeing. They were picking and choosing the fans who got to go to the game. This is still a country that they edit out the highlights of the defectors in Major League Baseball.
It was a scene in Cuba. One of the things that I found so inspiring about it, partly because there's just so much bad news, is that I think that when Cuba is isolated, it actually leads to more of those dictatorial tendencies that you talked about. It aids that when a country is in a state of isolation, when there's a siege mentality, when they can say that any act of resistance or protest is actually you're a stooge of the United States that's trying to upset the glorious nation that does exist. When you have openness, it's a lot harder to win that argument with the people itself. That's why they censor social media and the internet so much, because the more ideas, the better. And not just for Cuba, but for this country as well. And one of the fun things I had in talking about Cuba when that game was happening is how much of U.S. baseball history is actually dependent on Cuba. Issues like integration in the winter leagues and black and white players playing together in Cuba, that there were Cuban teams who were part of the Negro Leagues, that there has been baseball in Cuba since 1864. So before there was even professional baseball in this country, which is like 1869, I believe, with the Cincinnati Red Stockings, you had baseball in Cuba. So there's so much amazing intertwined history. So it's like if baseball is as American as apple pie, it's as Cuban as arroz con leche. And it was great to be able to tease out those connections for people, because I think there's an argument on this side of the ocean too that says, wait a minute, don't look at this as this foreign, faraway, enemy Cold War landscape, that we have to start figuring out how to build bridges for a new century and a new generation of people who don't want the old hatreds.
Should we have been there?
I think so.
To play baseball.
Yeah, because I believe in sports as diplomacy. You know, I wasn't alive for it, but I believe in what they did in the 1970s with China and ping pong. I think that the incredible friendship between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, between Jesse Owens and the Nazis who he ran against. I mean, there's just so much evidence that says, even in the most toxic of circumstances, the friendships between Tommy Smith and John Carlos and Peter Norman, the Australian who was on the medal stand at the '68 Olympics in Mexico City. There's so much beauty in the ability of sports to build bridges.
Now, will you clear up something? You did a book
with John Carlos.
Carlos. So explain John Carlos. Explain what happened in the '68 Olympics in Mexico.
I thank you for asking me that, because I talk about it every time and I get chills on the back of my neck, because I also traveled with John. He's become such a dear friend, and we've talked about it so much. 1968 Mexico City. I'm sure people know the moment of them raising their fists to the heavens, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, after the 200 meters race. But yeah, it was a moment, but it was also a movement called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. There was an effort for several years to actually organize a boycott of African-American athletes before those 68 games. And they really rested on a series of 4 demands. The architect of that was Dr. Harry Edwards, the great sports sociologist. And those 4 demands were: restore Muhammad Ali's title. They called him the warrior saint of the Black Athletes Revolt. That's a pretty badass demand.
Whoa,
to say we're not going to the
title too.
Yeah, I know, the warrior saint. I want a T-shirt that says warrior saint. Another demand was hiring more African-American coaches. Another was getting South Africa and Rhodesia disinvited from the Olympics. And another was having Avery Brundage, the head of the IOC, whose nickname was Slavery Avery to the athletes, to get him to step down as the head of the IOC. So these were very serious demands. and they were not able to win them other than the South Africa and Rhodesia one, which is that's actually why they were first disinvited from the Olympics, because of these demands. And yet, but the boycott fell through, so they're there in 68, so they realized they had to do something. So they didn't just bring those black gloves to the 200-meter race. They also brought beads as a symbol of lynching. They made a pledge to wear buttons that said Olympic Project for Human Rights. They didn't wear shoes on the medal stand because they said they wanted to have a symbol of poverty in the United States. And yet, of course, what did they have to do first?
They had to win.
I mean, how horrible would it have been if they'd come in 8th and they were like, we got these beads. What happened?
We're not wearing shoes.
We're not wearing shoes, and we lost.
Nobody would have cared.
Right. And then the race itself is amazing. I want people to please go to YouTube and look at this race because, you run these short distances. You're just supposed to look at that finish line. And you look at the race. John Carlos gets out to a huge lead. He's constantly looking backwards for Tommy Smith because it doesn't work unless they're both on the medal stand. So he's looking backwards, and he's looking backwards so much over his left shoulder, he doesn't notice over the right that Peter Norman beats him by just the slightest bit. And as John said, he said he didn't care because Peter Norman was also down for the cause. So Peter Norman also wears a button. You could see it in the picture.
So you have a white man who's wearing the...
Yeah, an Australian, at a time where Australia had policies similar to South Africa with regards to race and apartheid. And he's wearing this big button that says Olympic Project for Human Rights, and he paid a price for that as well. I could go on. Do you want to see this?
Well, no, what I'm curious about is I want to know what... I keep reading, or at least it's legend, that they were stripped of their medals.
No, they were not stripped of their medals.
Do they still have those medals?
Yes. John Carlos's medal is with his mother. She's pushing 100, God bless her, and she's living in North Carolina. And they actually went to their hotel room and said, "We want the medals."
After the games.
Yeah, when they're still in Mexico City. So after the event, the representatives from the IOC go up to them and say, "We want to have your medals. You're out of the Olympic Village, and we want your medals." And John Carlos looked at him and said, "But I don't see those people with you." And they said, "What people?" And John Carlos said, "Well, the army that you're going to have to bring if you're going to get this medal from me." But they did spread that lie that the medal was gone, so much so that before we wrote the book, if you went to the History Channel's website, they talk about them having their medals stripped away. And so part of writing the book, we got the History Channel to correct their definition of what took place, which is good because that lie was spread precisely as a way to tell athletes, like, you better not get out of line at the Olympics. Don't mix politics and the Olympics because, of course, there's nothing less political than the Olympic Games.
He's Dave Zirin, and that's what you get when you read him, sports editor of The Nation.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.